Shebahonaning, Shebahonaning. This sketch, called Shebahonaning, was published in 1855 by Lawrence Oliphant, former Civil Secretary and Superintendent General of Indian Affairs in Canada. We are looking toward the west end of the channel. George Island is on the left side of the sketch. On the right, on the mainland, is de la Mérendier's trading post and part of the village of Shebahonaning. Ani and good day. My name is Adele Loosemore and I'm a Treaty Indian from Shebahonaning. My community is at the entrance to the north channel of Georgian Bay, and I've put a white dot on the map below me to mark where we are situated. The Métis Nation of Ontario, in their registry policy of 2019, makes the point that if a person identifies as Indian, they cannot be Métis because they are different cultures. I think that identity can be communicated in many different ways. In this video, let's take a look at how the people of Shebahonaning expressed their identity. Our First Nations ancestors are Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. But the Métis Nation of Ontario and the Province of Ontario decided to change their ethnic identity to Métis. They did this by distorting some parts of the historic record and ignoring other parts of it. This manipulation of our ethnic identity is deeply disrespectful to our ancestors and our community, and it violates the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. This series of videos was created to show you that their claims are not supported by the historic record. Helen Tanner spent decades studying the history of First Nations people. In her Atlas of Great Lakes Indian History, she said that during the late 1700s, many Indian leaders of the Great Lakes lived in log cabins, some with glazed windows and stone fireplaces. By the 1850s, this practice was well established in the more southern or densely populated parts of the lakes, but it was also developing in the upper Great Lakes. In 1848, Indian Superintendent Thomas Anderson reported that the people of Garden River Village had built 15 houses for themselves. Superintendent George Ironside noted that the Indians living on the Point Grandin Reserve near Shebahonaning had built between 1852 and 1856 several comfortable log houses in which they now live. In 1851, Jesuit Father Dominic de Ranquet noted that there were 10 houses in the village. An 1855 sketch of Shebahonaning shows de la Mérendier's trading post, several wigwams, and one building in the background. This 1856 painting shows 3 wigwams on the mainland, one near the shore and 2 to the right of 2 cabins. This sketch shows 3 wigwams on the mainland and several in a cluster on George Island on the south side of the Killarney Channel. A passenger on the steamer Francis Smith described the scene on arriving in Killarney in 1874. The houses are chiefly wigwams, made of poles collected at a point at the top and spread out at the bottom, and covered with mats woven of rushes. The inhabitants profess the Roman Catholic religion and speak the French language. Newspaper articles of the 1860s to the 1890s indicate that wigwams and houses coexisted in Shebahonaning for decades. Our Anishinaabe ancestors spoke Ojibwe and French for many years, and later also English. The 1930s marked the last decade that Ojibwe was widely spoken by all the adults in Shebahonaning. Then, except for a few families, only the older people spoke it fluently. Eventually, the Ojibwe and French languages disappeared from our community. The Jesuits listed Killarney as one of their Indian missions, and in 1921 they were bragging about the success of the old Jesuit missionaries who reclaimed our Indian ancestors from savagery. When various religious institutions began operating Indian residential schools in the 1800s, our ancestors became part of that system and remained in it for many decades. This letter contains some very important information about our ancestors and our community. It's March of 1894, and Pierre de la Morandière writes to the Minister of Marine and Fisheries to ask if it's true that Indians can legally set nets to catch fish without having a license, as long as they don't sell the fish. Pierre says that his brother Dominic set his fishing nets, but the nets were cut, he believes by the fisheries overseer, so Dominic hasn't set any more nets. The Deputy Minister of Marine and Fisheries writes back and says a license is required if Indians are fishing with nets. So Indians can fish without a license, as long as they don't use nets. In his letter, here's how Pierre described the situation. It is the general impression here that Indians, or persons belonging to an Indian band, can catch fish for their own use without license, but not for sale. As my brother belongs to an Indian band, he thought he had a right to set a net, the same as everyone here belonging to Indian bands do. This is significant information about our community. Killarney Indians believe they have a right to catch fish without a license, that the right is an Indian one, and that the right is associated with being a member of an Indian band. Our ancestors knew that what they were doing was exercising their Indian Aboriginal rights. That doesn't sound like a Métis consciousness. And by the way, these letters are in the same fisheries file that MNO used to create that bogus story about the racial conflict in Killarney. PR's 1894 letter speaks directly to an Indian identity, so I'm not surprised that MNO ignored it. All of the families of Shebahonaning that the Métis Nation of Ontario name as their Métis ancestors were Robinson Treaty Indians. Eventually, in some families in the Robinson Treaties area, the department recognized the older children in a family as treaty Indians, but not the younger children. And in some families, Indian Affairs ignored the treaty rights of any of the children, even when they acknowledged the rights of both parents. These and other policies were used by the settler government to reduce and manage the Indian population. I'm going to show you parts of letters written by our ancestors to the Department of Indian Affairs. The letters relate to the issue of treaty rights, and they illustrate very clearly who our ancestors thought they were. The first letter we'll look at is from Sarah Bernard. Remember, MNO didn't find anyone in the Bernard family to be a documented Métis, but they're in MNO's membership register anyway, as part of a verified Métis family line. When Sarah wrote this letter, she was living at South Bay, where she was teaching at the Indian Day School. On the image at the left, I put a blue rectangle around the entry for the South Bay School, showing Sarah's name as the teacher. This is from the 1898 Indian Affairs Annual Report, the same year that Sarah first wrote to Indian Affairs. She asked why she and her brother are not receiving Robinson Treaty annuities when all of their brothers and sisters are. And she said, "We would be much delighted if you would grant us the same as the rest of the Indians." It's easy to conclude from this evidence that Sarah considers herself and her family to be Indians. I'll come back to Sarah's inquiries later in this video. Jean-Baptiste Roch also writes to Indian Affairs in 1898 to ask why his children have not been added to the Robinson Treaty pay list, when both he and his wife receive annuities and interest payments under that treaty. Jean-Baptiste writes, "I always, when required, gave either to the agent or to the interpreter the exact number, names, ages of my children, but they never drew any interest or timber money. I have repeatedly endeavored to have them admitted to draw money, but your agents, both the late and present one, always gave me, I thought, very frivolous answers." Later in the letter, he says, "It is a gross injustice to so deprive my children for so many long years of their just dues and privileges, a birthright that cannot be taken away from them." Here are three of the children that Jean-Baptiste was talking about. Cecilia, standing on the left, was born in 1896 and married Frank Fowler. Josephine, sitting down, was born in 1878 and married Charles Lowe. And Evangeline, standing at the right, was born in 1893 and later married Thomas Murray. Joseph Tranche-Montagne wrote to Indian Affairs several times about treaty annuities for his son. The Métis Nation of Ontario calls the Tranche-Montagnes a verified Métis family because in 1899 an Indian Affairs official reported a rumor that Joseph's father was a half-breed. When Joseph wrote the letter that I'm going to read, he was living at Collins Inlet, a village on the mainland across from Philip Edward Island. This little community was established as a result of the logging industry. A mill was built on the nearby Beaverstone River in the 1850s. The operations were moved to the Mazenazing River in the early 1860s. Before I read you this letter from Joseph, I want to explain that he refers to a certificate from the priest when he writes to Indian Affairs. And I wanted to explain that around these years, 1902, if you could not go to the place that the Indian agent was going to pay out the treaty annuities and bring your whole family with you, you could get your treaty annuities by mail, but in the words of Indian Affairs, you had to have a responsible white man write a letter for you saying who you were, that he verifies who you are, who your wife is, the date you were married, the names of all your children and the dates they were born, to verify that you and all of your family members are entitled to the treaty monies that you're asking for. So Joseph writes in June of 1902, I am asking you if it is so about my little boy, not on the pay lists of annuity. My little was born December 24, 1892, and he was put list and draw his money by Dr. Walton when he was agent. But since W.B. McLean agent, he didn't get no money. The first year I wrote to him about it. He told me he would see me in Killarney, but he did not come. And he told to send him a certificate to get by priest, and so did. And now he says it is impossible get it. But I have all the Killarney Indians for witness, and my wife and I can make an affidavit. So the boy draw money for 1 year, and I do not see how he do not get it. I believe all these agent pocket this money. But you, the Secretary of the Indian Affairs, you got to look after the Indians, and I hope you will look after this for me. Am yours truly, Joseph Tranche, Indian. Joseph's spelling and writing skills are a little rough, but he definitely can communicate. There's no problem understanding exactly what he's saying. And after Indian Affairs investigated, Joseph's little boy did get his treaty money. This postcard showing Channel Street in Killarney is from 1907. There are lots of fishing sailboats at the docks, and some of the wooden reels that were used for drying the fishing nets. Frank Solomon wrote to Indian Affairs in September 1904, and he says that both he and his wife draw treaty and timber money. But, he said, our children do not participate in the benefit of the privileges conferred by the Robinson-Huron Treaty. I wonder what is the reason that the agent of this district takes exceptions in that way, while the treaty stipulations explicitly states that the benefits arising out of the treaty shall be in perpetuity without any change being made. I have repeatedly told the agent through our chief, but my children have never been put on the pay sheets. Will the Superintendent General be kind enough to explain to me the reason the general agreements of the treaty are violated? In 1907, more than 40 people of Shebahonaning self-identified as part of a group of Potawatomi descendants who were owed payments under treaties made between their ancestors and the United States. Canada verified the list and submitted a claim to the U.S. government for those treaty monies. The record of names was called the Wooster Roll, after the man who compiled it. When these rolls were updated in 1918 and 1922, People from Shebahonaning continued to be included on this list. It's 1925, and Sarah Bernard is writing to Indian Affairs again, only this time under her married name, Sarah Oakes. It's been 27 years since her first inquiry about her treaty annuities. She sent this letter to her MP. He sent it on to Indian Affairs, asking why she was not recognized as her brothers and sisters were. She said she remembers being put on the treaty list. I had to touch the pen where the agent wrote our names down. I assume she means that she had to place a mark there, probably an X as her signature. At the beginning of her letter, Sarah says, I can safely say that if there are any Indians in this village of Killarney, we are, and I am not ashamed to say it. None of these letters support MNO's claim that these families were Métis. The people who wrote the letters explicitly refer to being Indians. In what other ways did our ancestors express their identity? This image was taken at the sugar camp of Pierre and Virginie de la Morandière. From left to right are Virginie, Ernestine Heights, and two of Virginie's granddaughters, Marcella and Stella Prue. They're making birch bark baskets for gathering sap, like the large pile of baskets in the foreground. This photo was taken around 1918. Every family had a sugar camp to go to, and just about the whole village would empty out when the sap started to run. We still have many camps operating every spring. There has never been a time when our community did not have sugar camps. Laundry day at the sugar camp in the 1930s. I don't know the smallest child on the left. The tallest one is Mabel Beauvais. The young boy standing in front of her is Ferdinand Bocage. The women from left to right, starting with the one in the hat, are Alma LaBelle Belair, Marie LaBelle Rock, Victoria Solomon Martel, Virginie Rock de la Morandière, Adele de la Morandière Loosemore, and Frances Solomon Beauvais. Georgina Rock, Louis Rock, Agnes Rock, and Vinnie Rock at the sugar camp in April 1949. At one of the sugar camps in the early 1950s. From left to right, Mary Prue, Margaret Beauvais, Virginia Loosemore, Marjorie Pitfield, Armand Rock, Gladys Rock holding Susan Rock, Maud Rock in the doorway, Eva McNabb, and Harry Loosemore. Let's go back again to the 1920s, to a letter written in 1922 by Pierre de la Morandière to Mrs. Albert John Lowe, whose maiden name was Genevieve Rock. In this image, she is sitting beside her husband with their children around them. In the letter, Pierre is talking about going to the provincial government to lobby for a road to be built to Killarney. And he says, I think it would be well for the ladies to call a public meeting to see who we should appoint to represent us before the government. Knowing that the government are always pleased to listen to the prayers of the ladies, I think you and Mrs. Loosemore would be quite capable to fulfill that duty. I will do all I can to assist you with all information necessary to lay before the government. So PR wanted his daughter, Adele Loosemore, shown on the left, and Genevieve Lowe to go to Toronto and present to the provincial government the community's case for road access. But that's not what happened. In the end, PR, Adele Loosemore's father, and Albert Lowe, Genevieve's husband, were chosen to make the trip and convince the government to spend the money necessary for building a road to the village. PR prepared a public notice about the gathering that was to be held to decide who was going to represent the community. This is a photo of the notice that he created. It's written on birch bark. And he writes, "Notice is hereby given that a meeting of the citizens," and then he crosses out the word citizens and he wrote heads of families, "of the village of Killarney and township of Rutherford." And then it goes on to say, "will be held at such and such a place in the village, at what hour." He leaves blanks for the time and the date to be filled in. This is in January of 1923. And he says the meeting is for discussing the advisability of appointing delegates to go and urge upon the Ontario government the great necessity of building a road. The notice is approximately 12 inches by 6.5 inches. It's an important part of the history of Shebahonaning, but I don't know its wider cultural significance. Next year, it'll be 100 years old, but the cultural meanings behind this act of writing on birch bark probably go back centuries in the history of the Anishinaabe. This postcard was issued in the 1940s. Many of our ancestors had given up or lost their treaty rights during the previous decade. Our community still didn't have road access. That would come in 1962, 40 years after PR wrote his letter to Genevieve Lowe. Whether they were treaty or non-treaty Indians, with or without road access, the people remained part of the lands and the waters. These net drying reels on the waterfront are strong symbols of the industry that was so important for us for so many decades. Those houses at the back of the image are on Channel Street. The one on the left used to be Alfred Egan's home. He married Philomène de la Morandière and was a commercial fisherman. It later became the home of Julian and Doris Lowe and family. The large house beside it belonged to the Jackmans, who owned Jackman's General Store. Here's somebody's crew fishing up a pond net. It's difficult to see who they are. On the left is John Skelter, and Louis de la Morandière is on the right, in Joe Rock's pond boat. And of course, tourism and sport fishing also became a large part of our economy. Here, guide Vinnie Rock helps a lady land her fish. From left to right, Andrew Solomon Sr., Fred Tyson, and Adolphe Tyson. From left to right, Jack Hoyland, Dan Rock Sr., and Jim de la Morandière, setting up a bear trap in 1946. Here's what the inside of it looked like. From left to right, Ernest Solomon, Andrew Solomon Sr., and John Sagamaw in April 1949. One of our elders from the Bateman family told me that he still has vivid memories of his grandmother picking plants for medicines. Ferdinand Bocage, who was born in 1923, talked about being at his grandmother's sugar camp in the spring. It's the one shown in this photo. Being at the sugar camp also signaled the time of year to pick golden roots. His grandmother, Catherine Solomon, would clear away a patch of snow where she thought the golden roots would have started growing, and instruct the children to pick them. She would dry them and use them in an herbal tea as a remedy for all kinds of illnesses. Aunt Aurélie de la Morandière, pictured here, could tell lots of stories about what she saw and what she learned about natural medicines. She learned it from her mother, Harriet Prue Rock, pictured here beside her. All this knowledge was handed down through generations. The skills of Harriet's grandmother, Nancy Wapoos, were highly regarded. Even Indian Affairs officials referred to her as Dr. Wapoos. Nancy Wapoos was also grandmother to all the Pitfields and the Batemans. They all lived on the Sarnia Reserve at one time. The story of how they came to Shebahonaning is for another video. Giashkwe. That was Harriet's traditional name. She married Frank Rock in 1889 and died in Shebahonaning in 1951. Harriet's husband, Frank Rock, was called Dibshash. He was born in 1862 and died here in 1943. Henry Solomon I was Pijikans, born in 1799 and died in 1867. Joannes, sometimes spelled as Joannes with a J, was a daughter of Henry. She married a Transmontaigne in 1851 and died in Shebahonaning in 1911. Sessagonakwe, Josette de la Morandière, wife of Etienne, who established a trading post here in June of 1820. We were always told her name meant woman of the falling snow. She died here in Shebahonaning in 1868. Miawajans, also called Josette de la Morandière, the wife of Etienne's son, Charles. She was born at Penetanguishene in 1820 and died here in 1879. Kabatakwe or Biabatakwe, Angelique Hughes. She married Alex de la Morandière, and she died here in 1892. Mizawek, also called Virginie Rock, who married Pierre de la Morandière in 1867. She died here in 1942. Her traditional name means universal. Gijagopanensi, Michelle Bernard, who married Madeleine Recollet in 1857 and died in Shebahonaning in 1915. Quaywalk. Madeline Aquaquagam married Joseph Recollet. They were the parents of Marguerite and Madeline Recollet. Denaqua was the traditional name of Elizabeth Prue, who married Charles King and lived on Manitoulin Island. Her sister, Alexandrine Prue, was born in 1877. Her traditional name was Mijaquatakwe. Another sister, Josephine Prue, was born in 1871. Her traditional name was Sessagonakwe. She first married Augustin Bernard of Shebahonaning. Some years after his death, she married Dan Bizion on the Thessalon Reserve. Wemeganabe, the uncle of the three Prue sisters. His European name was Jean-Baptiste Prue. He was married to Josette Lang in 1859 and died in 1928. Edward Prue, a brother to Harriet, who I talked about a couple of minutes ago, married Josette Cooper in 1892 and died in 1895. His name was Meteganagan. William West was called Macoons, or Little Bear. He was a half-brother to George Pitfield. On one Canadian census, they are recorded as William Wapoos and George Wapoos. Here's a photo showing a steamer coming in the west end of the channel. This image is from about 1905. The old hotel had burned in 1903, and this one replaced it. There are so many things still to talk about. Our elders, for instance. People like Alfred Bocage, Nancy Pitfield, Art Solomon, the Indian residential school system, and so on and so on. And another thing I want to mention, as you may have noticed, a couple of different family names showed up in this video. It'll be no surprise for some of you to hear that MNO and Ontario left out of their historical research and their 2017 fact sheet a whole bunch of families who intermarried with our ancestors and joined our village. To name a few, Bocage, Beauvais, Burke, Green, Hebert, Mendoshkin, Madweosh, Mashke, Sagamaw, Tyson, Wakagijig, Wawashkesh, Wendebence, and more. The Powley decision said that historic Métis communities must have stability and continuity. It's not just the long ago that matters. It's the links between the long ago and today, shared activities, and relationships among people over time. In our case, the historic community is Anishinaabe, not Métis. That's one of the things I'm hoping to show you through my YouTube channel.